Okay, so good evening. Um, Obviously, the Premier League has kicked off this weekend. Manchester United losing to Brighton, I think, is the biggest story to um, come out of this weekend so far. Um, yeah, tough start for Eric Ten Hag. Fans booing the team off the field at full time. Um, so his start to his reign in charge has got off to a rocky start. And people are already saying, "Oh, which manager's under the most pressure? Which manager's going to get sacked first this season?" I think that Lampard gets mentioned a lot at Everton. I don't like discussing managers. Should this manager be the first one sacked? What are the odds on betting odds on a manager getting sacked? I don't like that kind of talk. I really don't. I wouldn't want to be a football manager. Yeah, I think anyone who takes up that kind of role within the game, fair play to them. But Eric Ten Hag is going to realise that this isn't Ajax, this isn't the Dutch media. The British sports media are visceral, is the best way to describe them, pretty toxic. Um, and a couple more bad performances, they will be after him. They really will be after him. And Dutch managers haven't necessarily had the best track record in the English game. Um, Only a handful have won silverware in the English game that have come through the Dutch system, the Dutch coaching ranks. And we've had some good, Dutch players playing in the English league, and we've had some good Dutch managers, but success has been limited to Gullit, Van Gaal. I think Martin Jol might have won a trophy for Spurs, but Dutch managers don't tend to get the silverware. I mean, De Boer at Palace lasted just over a month and a bit, and was unceremoniously sacked because he just couldn't get the team going. Van Gaal was sacked by Man United because his style of football was too boring, apparently. Even though he was the best manager they've had since Alex Ferguson, he didn't last very long. Um, and he won silverware, so let that sink in. Um, so yeah, Eric Ten Hag has had a tough start, and it was a home game as well. A tough start to his tenure as Manchester United manager. Also, Major League Baseball has now announced that the Cardinals and the Cubs will be the two teams playing the 2023 London Series on the 24th and 25th of June next year. They've announced they're using the London Stadium again. So obviously they worked out the capacity, and it obviously worked well last time for them in 2019. Um, Initially, they were going to play this head to head in 2020. Obviously, COVID has impacted that, but they've announced the dates and the teams. It'll be interesting to see uh, the ticket price bands. In 2019, that was one thing that got criticised was the top end ticket price band was heavily criticised. The lower end tickets sold out pretty quick. So there's still things to work out with the 2023 and beyond Major League Baseball series, but they have announced they're going to use the London Stadium again. They have announced that it's the St. Louis Cardinals and the Chicago Cubs will be playing the two games, and they've announced the dates as well. So that's set in stone. So we've got 10 months, just over 10 months, um, to prepare for, be prepared for it. And in 10 months' time, we'll be having a return to Major League Baseball returning to London. So that's something to note. Um, but as I say, with Major League Baseball, I'm really surprised how late they left it to bring regular seasons games to Europe, considering the rival major leagues have been coming to Europe for decades. At this point, I've been saying it in every video, I'm discussing overseas series and taking games overseas, be it pre-season or regular season. How late Major League Baseball have left that initial decision to come over to Europe. Um, and while baseball in Europe is not necessarily the strongest, um, uh, let's say, untapped market, there is a potential to grow the sport and to tap into the European sports fan base um, by taking games over to Europe. Now, the NFL done that fantastically with London. The NBA were going to London, now they go to Paris. So the NBA have done it as well for a long, long time, and the NHL have been, rotating around European countries for many, many years. They've even been to the UK since the millennium. The NHL have been doing it quite successfully as well for a very, very long time. Not necessarily consistently, but successfully when they do come here. They've done Central Europe and Scandinavia, they've done Switzerland. So I am very surprised with Major League Baseball. Bearing in mind, Major League Baseball is coming off the back of a lockout and some fraught CBA negotiations to end the lockout that we had at the beginning of the year. Um, they've also had, since the last time they were in London in 2019, the Astros scandal in regards to sign stealing and cheating, possibly for their World Series victory a couple of years prior. When COVID shut down the league in 2020, the return to play talks were fraught, and there was a lack of trust between the players' union and the league. Rob Manfred is a commissioner under a lot of pressure. And what is also interesting is they've agreed to come back in 2024 and 2026, but they're not coming in 2025. That is an interesting omission in the coming years of not deciding to come consistently. They're leaving that gap. That is very, very interesting. Now, obviously, with the CBA negotiations that they've had, there could be some discussions to be had with regards to their CBA and regarding ongoing discussions for the most part about doing it every year. But no, Major League Baseball is a league that's facing a lot of challenges right now and has faced challenges for quite some time in comparison to its major league rivals, where it's trying to compete for the fans' attention and the American and Canadian dollars and all that. It is a league that has come off out the back of a very disruptive and difficult lockout period. And I was covering Major League Baseball a lot over the Christmas New Year period. A lot. I did a lot of Major League Baseball videos at the end of last year, beginning of this year. I don't normally make a lot of Major League Baseball content, and suddenly we were having videos and discussions about the lockout and about the collective bargaining agreement, about league minimum salary, and about escrow and free agency and restricted free agency and unrestricted free agency and a whole host of other economic issues, sort of like luxury tax, like the luxury tax and the lack of a salary cap, and how the luxury tax still benefits the wealthier owners and the wealthier franchises in the bigger markets that can afford to pay the luxury tax compared to the smaller market teams that just struggle to keep a core together and remain competitive for more than a couple of seasons after a player's left finish their entry level contract. They just can't afford to re-sign them. They lose good talent. It's very difficult to get players to take a hometown discount to stay, and how they're the only major league in North America to not have a salary cap system. And that's quite a striking set of events that ultimately led to the lockout. So the Major League Baseball lockout is interesting and is worth discussing. Because it does have a knock-on impact. And I do feel with the way the lockout ended and the way the players begrudgingly agreed to the league's terms, yet the Players Association board were totally against the terms that were on the table that the league put forward, says to me that I do think that we may see further labour unrest, like a player strike or another lockout, down the line within the next 5 years. I don't think Labour peace is assured, and I don't think the situation can go on as it is, because what is really interesting is they're still paid less than the NHL, a league that makes half as much revenue per year as Major League Baseball, yet can afford to pay its players more, league minimum and average salary. So there is still economic issues to discuss and be discussed in regards in regards to um, the Major League Baseball and the ongoing labour issues. Let's just have a quick look at the football scores quickly, if we can find them. Uh, Man City beat West Ham. Man United lost Brighton. Brentford drew at Leicester. Um, let's have a look. Let's have a look at the football scores. So Brentford Leicester was a 2-2. Brighton beat Man United 2-1, and West Ham Man City was a 2-0 win for Man City. So as things currently stand, the top of the table is Tottenham, um, Arsenal, Bournemouth, Man City, and Newcastle, all won on opening day. But Spurs have the best goal difference with a +3. Bournemouth, Arsenal, Man City, and Newcastle on a +2. Brighton and Leeds and Chelsea are on a +1. Brentford, Fulham, Leicester, and Liverpool all drew, and then of course everyone else lost. Uh, it'll be interesting to see the table after the first month, and then it'll be interesting to see the table when we go into the mid-season break for the World Cup in November. That'll be the most interesting thing. It's the first week of August, and there's people already saying, and there's already media pressure and speculation concerning Frank Lampard um, at at Everton. I think uh, I think that's a bit unfair. The speculation already surrounding um, the managerial position at Everton. I think Everton is a club that is badly run off the field. I've discussed that at length many times. The Everton managerial merry-go-round goes back to the beginning of the channel in 2017. The departure of Ronald Koeman, and then the ins and outs that Everton have had since then. They've not had any managerial stability for any long period of time. They've gone through a lot of managers in the last 5 years. Um, that lack of managerial stability is being played out um, uh, on and that has obviously impacted where the team finished last season and the direction the team is taking. You could argue Man United as well. A lot of managerial changes, lack of success. They just have more spending behind them. Um, Everton could struggle this season. I don't necessarily think that's on Lampard. I think that's on ownership, and I think that's on decisions that have been taken at the club over a lengthy period of time, going back to the days when Bill Kenwright was pulling the financial strings, not Morshy. We could go back 20 odd years ago. The issues with Everton and the direction that club has taken over a very long period of time. The same could be said for a lot of clubs, for being brutally honest. Um, I think a lot of clubs have been badly run for a very long time, and that is borne out in the lack of success that a lot of clubs have had. Now, we're only into the first weekend of the season. Can't read too much into one game. After the first month, at the end of August, beginning of September, we can get a good read on what teams are doing well and what teams are struggling. And of course, the transfer window is still open. Players can still be signed. So it'll be interesting to see where clubs are at the end of the August transfer window. And then we've only got September, October, and a bit of November before play has to stop for the World Cup. There's only like 2.5 months before the league suspends playing and we go to the Qatar World Cup. So it'll be very interesting to see moves that teams make between now and August 31st, and it will then also be very interesting to see where teams are at going into the World Cup break, and it'll be interesting to see what moves happen in the next transfer window, and should any managers be replaced before the World Cup break. I would think it would be, because it's such a disrupted season, I would think it would be a pretty brave chairman or a pretty brave board to decide, you know what, we're going to make a change, considering how disrupted the season is going to be. Um, but yes, there are some managers who are going to be under pressure if it doesn't pan out. Um, we could see some managers losing their jobs, absolutely. Always look for the promoted sides, possibly to make a managerial change, um, and look for teams in their second or third year in the Premier League. So your Leeds, your Brentfords, there could be possibility of a managerial change. That generally is what happens. Um, and teams that are underperforming for spending big money, and that is actually Everton. Everton have underperformed with the amount of money that they have spent. They've been regularly criticised in the British and international sports media for decisions the club has taken under the current ownership and the amount of money spent, and the fact that they've had the Benitez experiment didn't work. Ancelotti didn't want to stick around. Questions need to be asked about the fact that these are world-class managers who've won the Champions League, don't want to stick around and develop this team. That tells you something has gone horribly, horribly wrong within the club and within the club structure. So things aren't all well at Everton. And then there's the discussion about Barcelona and their spending in this transfer window and where they're getting the money from to spend, which um, has raised some has raised some has raised some uh, has raised some uh, has raised some which has raised some questions in regards to where the money's coming from, where they can afford and justify the spending that they are. You look at their wage bill, that is ridiculous. Their wage bill is absolutely ridiculous. They are spending far, far too much on wages. The, there is clearly discussions to be had in regards to Barcelona, where they're getting this money from, because they can't even afford to pay the players they currently have. The fact how they can justify signing some of these players. And there's been huge question marks over their financial dealings for some time anyway. And more questions are being asked about the financial spending rules that are currently in place, and the potential spending rules that are going to be brought in order to rein in club spending and make clubs more financially stable. Barcelona are anyway in breach of financial fair play, so there are questions over that. Good start for Haaland. Will Man City win the league? Look, it's first weekend. He didn't have the greatest charity shield last weekend. Liverpool easily won that match, and he had a poor run out in that game. Yes, he scored 2 key goals, and he wins them the game against West Ham. West Ham are not a bad side. So in that regard, yes, he's had a good start to the league season. Let's just sit more comfortably. He's had a good start. He's had a good start to the league season, but it's one game. There's a long way to go. He will not be at the World Cup, so he's not one of those players that's going to the World Cup in November and December because he's a Norwegian player. Norway haven't qualified, so he can physically just rest for 2 months. Haaland is one of those players who will benefit by not going to the World Cup. So as soon as the Premier League season, in fact, the European seasons are on a break, he's not one of those players that's going to be playing at the World Cup. So for Haaland, it's to be a very good season, and which could benefit Man City. However, they've got a lot of players who will be going to the World Cup. Injuries can get picked up. Um, they could have to quarantine because of COVID, depending if there are any COVID outbreaks. There's going to be, it could be a good and bad thing. Is Haaland the greatest player not at the World Cup? I wouldn't say he's the greatest of not playing at the World Cup. Some great players in the past have not played at the World Cup. He's still young. He's still got a very long career ahead of him. And there's some other good young Norwegian players coming through as well. So he could be at the next Euros or the next World Cup. We just don't know. I think George Best is one of them. Yes, never to play at a World Cup. Absolutely. George Weah is another one. Footballer of the Year, Ballon d'Or winner. So there's been some very good players who've not played at World Cups and Euros tournaments in the past. Haaland, he's still young. And yes, it's one game. One game doesn't make a season. And as I say, we're going to have to look at where teams are at when we go into the pause, and what decisions are made in the transfer market coming out of the pause when play resumes after Christmas, after Boxing Day, when the January transfer window opens. I wouldn't be surprised if some managers have been given the chop before the World Cup. Eric Ten Hag and Frank Lampard are two managers coming out of this weekend already under pressure after just one game. Yes, the media has a big part to play in that. I think Eric Ten Hag has come from a very winning, positive culture in Ajax, and he's been put into a very difficult and toxic culture at Man United, where the fan base is restless. The media has an obsession with the goings on at this club. The players were booed off. First game of the season, the players were booed off. Now, the funny thing is, all the 3 goals were scored by Brighton players because there was an own goal. Man United did not score a goal. The own goal is where they get their goal from. Yes, Chile have qualified for the Rugby World Cup. The US have got into the repechage tournaments. The US have the final last chance saloon to make it to France next year. I think in the long run, Major League Rugby is going to pay off. But there needs to be better cooperation between franchise-led Major League Rugby and US Rugby, which has limited involvement with the domestic league. It's going to require better cooperation to develop the player base, and the same with Rugby Canada as well, because Rugby Canada hasn't qualified. Canadian Rugby hasn't qualified. Major League Rugby, I think, will benefit the North American nations in time, but it needs much more coordination and cooperation between the league and the 2 unions of Canada and the US in order to benefit the US and Canada going forward. It is nice to have new nations qualify for tournaments. Yes, absolutely. We've seen that in the women's Euros. We've seen that in the men's Euros last year. We're going to see it at this World Cup because Qatar obviously being hosts. They're the only debutants this time round. So yes, it is nice to see new nations qualify. We're going to see it at the Rugby League World Cup as well with Jamaica and Greece. So yes, I do like that. That is a positive. It's showing that the sport globally is growing, which is fantastic. The fact that the Canadians haven't qualified and the US have to go into the repechage tournament does raise some concerns, and that's not Major League Rugby's fault. I think in the long run that is going to benefit both the US and Canadian national sides going forward. In the women's game, the US and Canadian teams are actually very, very strong and do very, very well. So something has gone wrong in the structures and the systems they put in place and the development programs they had in place for both sides not to have qualified. Well, the US still have a chance, and going into that repechage tournament, they should be favourites. Should be. in theory. But as we've seen, Chile qualify, knock the US into the repechage tournament. The fact that Uruguay dominated them easily and Canada swept them aside. I think a big part of the problem is that the America's Rugby Championship hasn't been taking place because of COVID, where the North and South American nations, apart from Argentina, competing. Because that hasn't been taking place, I think that lack of competitive matches is I think starting to have an impact as well. And the US and Canada used to participate in the Pacific Nations Championship alongside Fiji, Tonga, and Samoa and Japan. And again, they no longer compete in that, so they join the Americas Rugby Championship, and then COVID comes along. So yeah, Hong Kong do compete at international sport separately from China. Yes, as do Macau. They are a separate entity when it comes to international sport. So yes, Hong Kong do have a rugby union side. They were in the last repechage tournament, the last Rugby Union World Cup in Japan. They failed to qualify in 2018. The Hong Kong Sevens. Yes, Hong Kong is a special administrative division of the People's Republic of China. But yes, they do have, when it comes to international sport, they are separate from China, and they do compete. They used to compete at the Commonwealth Games. Hong Kong are separate from China when it comes to international sport. However, they are governed by China, but they have special administrative status, much like Macau, which is the old Portuguese colony in China. They have the same administrative status in the sense that they have special administrative divisions, and they have a different currency to mainland China. And in international sport, they are allowed to compete as separate nations, separate from China. So you will see Hong Kong at the Olympics, and you will see Hong Kong at the World Championships, etc., etc. And you will see Hong Kong in Rugby World Cup qualifiers, and they will be in the repechage tournament. So it would be nice to see Hong Kong do it. I can't see them doing it, however. I just don't think they have the quality and the player depth that the US have. It would be a long shot if they were to do it. It would be like a miracle. In saying that, you know, do I? It means you get to watch like the tier 2 and tier 3 nations play each other, which means you get some more international rugby union, and you get to see. I've watched the last repechage tournament. I don't mind it. I watched the whole of the 2018 Rugby World Cup qualifying repechage tournament. I actually really enjoyed what I saw. Yes, it's not the top level rugby union that we used to see in the Rugby Championship and the Six Nations, but in saying that, it's a chance for a tier 2 or tier 3 nation to qualify for the World Cup. The fact that the US are in it is the big surprise out of this. And that's the big shock, is that the US are in the repechage tournament. And you have to ask the questions of why. Why are the? I would expect the US to win it. I think if they weren't to win it, massive questions would have to be asked about their structures, their programs, their youth systems, the cooperation between the union and Major League Rugby for player development and governance. A lot of questions would be asked if they don't qualify. But the fact they are in the repechage means questions need to be raised about why they haven't qualified outright. And that's nothing against Chile, that's nothing against Uruguay, who've obviously taken advantage of the Major League Rugby league with some of their the European leagues and helping grow their players and their players playing in top leagues. And they've really developed really well in the last 5 to 10 years. The US, yes, questions do have to be asked about why they are having to go through the repechage. The fact that if they do qualify, they are qualifying after Chile, after Uruguay. And then you have to scratch your head about why they're in this position. If they don't qualify from it, that's a far bigger dissection of the situation. It's like when the US men's football team didn't qualify for the 2018 World Cup. Um, there was a lot of questions and a lot of soul searching, and a lot of commentators were blaming the MLS system. And you can't do that because some of the top American players play in Europe. So you can't blame the domestic league for the failure of the national side. And questions were asked about their player development, structures, funding, youth development, their youth system, the relationship between the US Federation and the league, which is a franchise model. So if the US rugby doesn't qualify, the same questions will be asked about why have they taken a step back, considering that they will be hosting both the men's and women's World Cups at the end of the decade. Same with the Football World Cup; they will be hosting it in 4 years' time. So they need a good showing coming up. I'm watching the Commonwealth Games cricket final. India having a batting collapse. Yeah, batting collapses. They tend to happen quite regularly. The weather conditions, I think, have been very, very conducive to the cricket competition. I went out earlier today for a little explore, which is up on my Instagram and my personal Facebook page. I was going to do a video on the other channel, but I was actually enjoying the peace and quiet. There weren't a lot of people out. I was just enjoying the peace and quiet of the walk I was on. The weather, I mean, the lack of rain we've had in the south and the east, especially, but also, to be fair, in the Midlands to a certain extent. But where I live, we've had a little bit of drizzle, a couple of little light showers overnight in the best part of a month and a half. There are water shortages and water use bans, so hose pipe bans in place. In Hampshire, the Isle of Wight, I think Kent and Sussex are going to bring them in. The Isle of Man's already brought one in. They've had more rainfall than further south, but they've had below average rainfall. So there's already concerns about water shortages. So while it's great cricketing conditions for playing, the weather conditions have had an impact on the sport. I've been watching a lot of motorsport. Every weekend I watch like touring cars and GT racing and motorcycle racing all over the world. And yesterday I was watching the TCRs, which is the Touring Car Championship below the British Touring Car. It's the championship below British Touring Cars, and they were at Castle Combe, which is a bit further down the M4 in the West Country. Thruxton's my local circuit, but Castle Combe is the other circuit that's reasonably local to me, which I can get to within an hour and a half, 2 hours. And the temperatures were causing problems. Causing issues for the tyres and the cars overheating, and track temperature, air temperature. So motorsport's been affected massively, and it's been the same in the endurance racing like Le Mans and the 24 hours of Spa and the 6 hours of Monza, the 6 hours of Spa in the European Endurance Championship. Cars have been overheating. Drivers have been overheating. Weather conditions have been noted. So with the weather that we've had across Europe, especially since I'm going to say March, so far this year is having an impact on sport. I mean, I think we saw it in the Women's Euros. It definitely had an impact on performance, and I think that's probably one of the reasons why a lot of goals were scored. Is defenders, the teams were exhausted. Do I like the Commonwealth Games? I haven't watched any of this year's Commonwealth Games or the previous Commonwealth Games 4 years ago. I used to watch the Commonwealth Games to a fair degree when I was younger. Same with the Olympics. But those kind of sporting events, I've sort of it's not as much of a tradition now for me as it was before. I've sort of my joy of them has sort of waned. I like the individual events like like the rugby sevens, like the field hockey, like the cricket. If those individual sports, if I'm watching a test series, for example, or a T20 series, or um, something like that, and it's just a standalone tournament, absolutely, I'll watch field hockey, I'll watch cricket, I'll watch rugby sevens if it's a standalone tournament. But when it's in a competition like the Commonwealth Games, the Olympics, to me, I slightly feel disconnect from it. If that makes a lot of sense. But fair play for Birmingham for hosting it. But I think it's this Commonwealth Games hasn't had the controversy that the Gold Coast one had 4 years ago in Australia. That was a very controversial Commonwealth Games. There was a lot of discussion about the cost, some of the controversies surrounding the event, um, and there was a lot of negative headlines about that last Commonwealth Games. The Birmingham Commonwealth Games has been under the radar. I think it's been great for the city of Birmingham. They've been preparing and investing in for it for years. Um, um, but I think, well, sports are 24/7 discussion point. At the moment, certain sports that I enjoy, like ice hockey, are in the off season. Uh, Rugby league is in the what we call the finals push, so the last month or so of the regular season before you go into the finals, which is playoffs basically. So the NHL and domestic hockey, ice hockey leagues are in the off season. Some signings are being made and trades are being made. Been a bit quiet on the news front in regards to the NHL and hockey in general. I call it hockey, ice hockey, of course. Um, Field hockey is separate. Rugby league, the NRL and Super League is what I call the second half of the season. It's the end of the regular season, that push for finals and to make the top eight and therefore make finals. Um, and there's been discussions about player movement and there's been some noise coming out of this weekend in regards to some comments Ricky Stewart made following his side's defeat at Penrith, and there was an incident in the game where one of the Penrith players kicked out at one of his players, and he made some disparaging comments. He could get heavily fined and suspended, and that could derail Canberra's season. Um, do I think my sports schedule is too much? Well, it depends on how you mean by schedule. I think with the fact that we've had the Rugby League World Cup delayed by and the Women's Euros, and of course the Men's Euros as well, that's actually impacted on scheduling for this year's World Cup, for example, in the football and the Rugby League World Cup as well, because I think it's the first week of October is grand final week in the NRL, and on the 15th of October, the Rugby League World Cup kicks off. So you've got about a week to 10 days, I think, between the grand final in the NRL grand final in Sydney and the start of the Rugby League World Cup. So there's not a lot of turnaround and time off for the players. So what would be their off season, they're diving straight into a World Cup, and so a lot of these players will be pretty tired come the end of the tournament. And of course, then you've got pre-season starts just after Christmas, and then you get the pre-season matches, the warm-up matches before the season starts in February for the NRL, and February is when the Super League and the Championship and League One starts here in the UK, and then you're back into the league grind within a month or so of the World Cup final. So these players don't get a lot of time off in the next till next year, basically in rugby league. So top rugby league players are going to be playing a lot of matches and not having a lot of downtime for their bodies to recover. And I do think there is more players getting injured more regularly. So, and I've mentioned that in my career videos, like Benji Marshall and Sam Burgess and James Graham. I mean, they could have played more games. That is what's actually scary. Um, Commonwealth Games is getting better with sports like netball, field hockey, and T20. Team sports you like, fair play. I mean, I like I like T20 cricket. I think it's a good addition to the Commonwealth Games. But that's an ICC initiative, not ECB initiative. The ICC trying to grow the game more globally and sees the Commonwealth Games as a good chance to, grow the image of cricket to a wider casual audience who may become hardcore fans. Um, Rugby sevens. I watched rugby sevens, but well, I've played rugby sevens, and it is similar with rugby league nines. It is a faster pace version of the game because you've got more space. You've got less players on the field, so there's more space for players to exploit. It's basically designed for the skill players to show off their skills. Um, I think it's physically demanding. You play multiple matches in a day, and a tournament can last only as little as 2 or 3 days. A sevens tournament will last, so it is brutal. Rugby sevens is brutal. There's not a lot of recovery time between games, so if you're injured, you're in trouble. If you're carrying a little niggle, you're in more trouble than in a regular, say, World Cup or in a regular league season. You can sort of play with an injury and have protected minutes, especially in rugby league with an interchange. Rugby sevens or rugby league nines, you're in trouble if you've got that dicky knee or you've got that bad shoulder or you're recovering from rib cartilage injury and you've got to have strapping or you've got an AC joint problem and we're going to require surgery at the end of the season. You are very vulnerable to being exposed defensively and at risk of aggravating that injury because you do not have the break um, uh, between matches. Um, how did tier 2 and 3 nations in Europe get better without access to the Six Nations? This is not just access to the Six Nations, but the Rugby Championship for the Southern Hemisphere nations as well. This is what Augustine Peashot was arguing, 3 years ago in the build up to the Rugby World Cup and the Rugby World Rugby elections for being the next president for World Rugby, going against Bill Beaumont. He argued that the wealthier nations and the top paid players need to take a bit of a haircut when it comes to finances, and the money needs to be better distributed around the game. Now, look at the development some of these tier 2 nations have had, like Uruguay, like Chile. You know, Brazil have improved massively. Argentina are now a rugby championship side. So it took so long for them to get that next step up after the 2007 World Cup. It took a few more years. It took the best part of the decade for Argentina to be accepted. Look at some of the Pacific Island nations like Tonga and Fiji and Samoa. I mean, Samoa are basically bankrupt, but Fiji and Tonga are pretty solid rugby nations. Japan are now classed as a tier 1 nation. It is difficult, and I think there's no easy solution um, to the issues. I think you could argue that professionalism hasn't necessarily uh, worked as well as it should have, and how professionalism has been handled since 1995. So over the last 27 years, it hasn't fully worked as envisaged. And yeah, people go, I feel for Georgia, I feel for Romania, and you feel for Spain. Italy were in the same boat for the best part of 20 years. They were knocking on the door of what was the Five Nations. And had they been accepted in the 80s and the 90s, how different things could be. Um, and that was the resistance from what we call the old boys um, of the old Five Nations, which includes France, and of course, the home nations here and Ireland. And now you're seeing that same resistance to Georgia and Romania taking that next step. Um, there is no perfect solution to um, rugby's funding matrix problems. There is no perfect solution. I think I think it's a flawed international system um, for the tier one nations and those tier two and tier three nations that want to take the next step. I do think that, ironically, I prefer watching international test matches between the tier three and tier two nations. I find them far more enjoyable to watch. I'm starting to go off rugby union. Um, I don't enjoy watching it as much. Um, I think the international game as a whole, the game globally as a whole, has a lot of issues it needs to tackle. And um, I don't think Bill Beaumont's governance of World Rugby, the former IRB, is tackling them as effectively as they could. And yes, COVID's had an impact, and the finances um, of rugby union in general are a bit precarious. If we're being brutally honest, look at the collapse of Super Rugby as a format. Look at the issues the Welsh game is facing right now. I actually have concerns about uh, Welsh Rugby Union going forward. I really do. I think the fact that their clubs are the domestic game and then the provincial game is basically bankrupt is a concern. The fact that there's actually more professional football sides in Wales now than rugby union sides, and the fact that they get better attendances um, and they've qualified for World Cups, and the women and the football side of things is in a very healthy place right now. Um, Tells its own story. Um, but the money issues that Welsh Rugby Union is facing is as predates COVID and predates the 2019 World Cup. Um, and out of the Six Nations, Wales financially are in a bit of a mess, and they are. I think Scotland are as well, but they are in a very weak financial position, um, and that is a concern. Um, and long term, I don't know what the future holds for Welsh rugby domestically financially, but I don't have a good relationship on this channel with Welsh rugby fans, so and that's a historical dislike for each other. I'm, but there are massive problems that the Welsh Union is facing, and the Welsh clubs are facing. The money issues have been there long before COVID came along. There's also a big steroid use culture. Half the athletes in the UK that are currently on the ban list for performance enhancing and recreational drug use, failed drugs test, are Welsh. And the majority of them are rugby players of both codes. There is an endemic issue within the sport in Wales for performance enhancing and recreational drug use on the ban list. And I watched a documentary that was done quite a few years ago now. I think it was back in 2015, and it's quite shocking the numbers and the stats that come out of all the athletes that have failed a dopes test or a drugs test. Yeah. Does union have to change with the worrying reports of early onset dementia? Um, you have to remember when some of these players were playing, we knew less about concussions than what we do now. Um, and the same can be said for ice hockey, the NRL, rugby league. Um, I've noticed that they have definitely, especially with watching the NRL as much as I have, the amount of players now are going, you know what, I'm going to sit out the rest of this season. I'm going to recover from this concussion. Um, rugby league, especially in Australia, seems to be taking it more seriously. The NHL in the US and Canada is definitely taking concussion or just injuries in general, but concussion especially more seriously. Um, there seems to be rugby union. I think is I work with a couple of lads who play at a couple of our local rugby clubs. A couple of my colleagues, one uh, plays at Bratton Rugby Club and one plays for one of the Reading Rugby Clubs. The two of them play at one of the Reading Rugby Clubs. So I actually work with some rugby players who are, you know, one of them is also a women's coach as well. But I work with some rugby players, and it is interesting. We always seem to discuss because one of them is having some sleep issues right now, and he's been having some sleep issues for quite some time. And I said, when was the last time you had a concussion? He goes, "Not for a while." Um, and I ask about what other injuries has he had, like knees, ankles, shoulders, back. He does have a few little niggly injuries. And he's like, I've not had a concussion for a while. I said, okay. And he's still not 100%. So I said, just go to your doctor and just say, look, you are a rugby player, and you've had some little injuries here with your knees, your ankle, your back, your shoulder, all that kind of stuff. Your standard wear and tear. But say you have had concussions in the past, even if it hasn't been in the last 12 months, and get checked out. There could be something not quite right there. Um, I would say that tackle technique has got a big thing to do with it. I think the ruck and the maul is different to league um, because of the amount of bodies going into a ruck or a maul and a scrum. League does have an issue as well. I think, but they've noticed they've got an issue far quicker, and the way they implement the concussion protocols, the grading, the player's clearly knocked out, he's not coming back. They've got concussion protocols where if a player has failed an HIA, just being a little bit groggy, he probably won't play for a week or two, or won't be allowed to train for a couple of weeks. I mean, there are some players who've just said, look, I'm not playing for the rest of the season. We have seen players retire from concussion. Um, I wouldn't say it's more common in Union than League. I just think the way that Rugby League, especially, or the NRL, which is I watch a lot of, although I have seen obviously the Challenge Cup and that includes Super League teams with the Challenge Cup, which is the Rugby League equivalent of the FA Cup for those uneducated, those who are not familiar with it. What I've noticed with the amount of Rugby League that I can see, I mean, I've watched a full NRL fixture list this weekend, so I watched every single NRL match this weekend. Yes, not every bash to the head is going to concuss you. And even a perfectly clean, safe chest high challenge, the whiplash can concuss you. You don't have to be knocked out to be concussed. Sometimes you can be knocked cold and not concussed at all. Other times it could be the slightest head knock and you are concussed. So it's. I'm just going to sit up straight. I wouldn't say there's more concussions in league over union. I would say it's how they deal with concussion. So we know that Kalen Ponga, for example, the Newcastle Knights captain is sitting out the rest of the season. They're not going to make the finals. They're not in the top eight. They're not even close to top eight. He may go to the World Cup if he is fit enough. But basically, we won't see him again until next year. I don't see Kalen Ponga going to the World Cup. There are other fullbacks and wingers who are ahead of him in his position. He can play wing as well. There are other players ahead of him in the position he plays who are eligible for Australia. I cannot see him going there. And so I don't think there's more concussions in Union over League. I just think the way that League is deciding to actually have independent doctors in the stands, have um, more communication between the team doctors and the independent doctor, Um, Video refs going, no, you've got to come off. Um, they are, yes, it's a bit knee jerky in the reaction to it, but the choice is taken out of the player's hands. Will golf ever be? I mean, we can come back to this topic in a minute. But when I do videos on player welfare and discussing concussion or just injuries in general and rushing players back, then when I do player profiles and things like that on players, and I especially look at Benji Marshall, look at Sam Burgess. Sam Burgess retired 4 years into 4 years before his contract ended. Now that sink in. He's contracted until next year. Um, because of a chronic shoulder injury. He's contracted until 2023. He retired in 2019. Now, it is a bad contract if you actually look how much money he's been paid um, under the salary cap, but he retired with 4 years left on his contract. Benji Marshall, I think by the time he was 25, had 3 shoulder reconstructions. So it's not just head injuries and concussion that is a big problem. And of course, there's a YouTuber I follow called the Hockey Guy, and as it's the off season, he's doing a lot of player profiles, and the amount of players who had seasons lost to injury or massive games they haven't been able to play because of injury, and then he does videos on this guy retired because of concussion, this guy retired because of concussion, this guy concussions had an impact, didn't play for a season. Um, Yeah, the CTE lawsuit and some of this, I think they are scare tactics coming out in the media. I think there is a media agenda, and it's, I think it's basically we know players are going to get concussed. We know players are going to have injuries like a broken arm, a broken leg, AC joints. I mean, I saw a guy in the rugby league this weekend. He dislocated his knee. You could physically see his leg was out of place, and he'd done all his PCL, MCL, and ACL, blown his whole knee up. He still walked off. Well, when I say walked off, he had help, but he wasn't going on the stretcher. This is where sometimes when you've done a knee injury like that or a leg injury, don't walk off. Just swallow your pride and save your leg because you're causing more damage to your joint. In high school, athletes would have to take concussion tests. I think, yeah, no, that is a well-known thing. You would deliberately put down really easy questions to answer on your concussion test, like the first 4 letters of the alphabet backwards, DCBA, for example. Something that you would have to be seriously retarded not to know. And I struggle with that, and I've got ADHD, so maybe not the alphabet backwards. Um, um, but yeah, a lot of professional athletes have done the similar thing where they're deliberately um, dumbing down the questions that are put down for their personal questions to ask. The basic standard questions are day, month, year you were born, and your birthday month. So the year you're born, the year, month, and day you're born. Day of the week it is generally a Saturday. Who knew? Um, hmm, when you're playing professional sport, although things like ice hockey, you might have 3 games in a week, but it's generally a Saturday. Where you are, look at the jersey you're wearing. If it's the light jersey, you're probably the away team. If it's the coloured jersey, you're probably the home team. Um, and various things like that. And they deliberately, when they're not concussed, put down the really easiest questions that are really easy answers, like favourite colour, blue. Second favourite colour, green. Like things like that. Um, uh, so there is that. So that is a system that is very open to abuse. And when you are sober and not concussed, you and your team doctor set the question. And there's a lot of pressure put on the team doctor to pass you fit um, by team management. That's been known to be a thing. So that's where the independent doctor comes in. and we'll ask you more difficult questions like, what is your mother's maiden name? And he will know what your mother's maiden name is because whatever. And if you struggle to remember, is it this, is that? No. My mother's maiden name is Carter. And so there you go. Looking at the Rugby World Cup draw, is it unbalanced? I actually haven't looked at the Rugby World Cup draw because the final team hasn't qualified yet. Until all teams are qualified, there is no point in actually doing a preview of the Rugby Union World Cup for next year. But I would say it probably isn't, quite honestly. A big nation goes out in the group stage. Maybe two big nations go out in the group stage. Normally, like an Argentina or one of the Six Nations goes out the group stage. Sometimes both go out the group stage. But I remember 2015. England had England, Wales, and Australia were all in the same group. So that was the group of death, and it was for England. And you know, I wouldn't say it's necessarily completely unbalanced. I would say it could be better. It could definitely be better. But there is no perfect system in order to balance out groups and who's where, and of course the turnaround between games that's been regularly criticised in the past, where some of the smaller nations are going, we're playing more regularly than some of the bigger nations have longer periods between games in a very congested tournament. England and Wales are in the easier section for the Rugby World Cup draw. You say that, but England and Wales aren't playing particularly well at the moment. So while the draw may look easy, 12 months is a very, very long time. This time next year, we'll be discussing how badly or how well the Six Nations campaign went. Is Wayne Pivac or Eddie Jones still coaching these sides? Should they be sacked? All this kind of stuff. The same arguments we've been having for eternity, it seems. Until, let's say, the US, for example, because they're very likely to get out the repechage tournament, have qualified, there is no point in actually looking at the World Cup draw until all teams are confirmed. At the same time, we don't know what's going to happen in the autumn tests and in the Six Nations at the beginning of next year. There's a lot of rugby, both at club and international level, to be played in the next 12 months before the World Cup. So to say they've got the easier section, on paper, yes. In reality, you don't win games on paper. So I've got bloody hell, my back is really playing up, and this bloody heat isn't helping. So when people say, "Oh God, pillows," it's better. It's better. So when people say England or Wales have an easier section, I don't buy into that because that's on paper. That's not in practical nature. It's all well and good revising for the exam and doing mock tests, but until you actually do the test under exam conditions in that example, for example, I don't know. And to say they've got an easier draw, we've heard this before with football World Cups and Euros and World Championships, and Commonwealth Games, and various bits and pieces, various tournaments and various formats of international sport or club sport, like Champions League groups and things like that, and FA Cup draws, like routes to the final. Strength of schedule. That's another thing I can't stand. Strength of schedule is very flawed. And I mean, look, Liverpool and Fulham drew. 2-2 yesterday. Bournemouth won. So already Nottingham Forest lost. So out of the three promoted teams, the team that actually finished first in the Championship last season drew. The team finished second wins, and the team that won the playoff final lost. So that one is again on paper, Liverpool should batter Fulham. Bournemouth's probably going to draw at best, and Nottingham Forest, with the way they finished the season, okay, on form. But games aren't won on paper. My opinion on the Commonwealth Games, I've gone off the Commonwealth Games and Olympics in recent years. And this Commonwealth Games has gone under the radar a little bit. With darts, because of the Olympics, no. Usain Bolt's records, possibly. Wales seem to always draw Australia or Fiji, which is getting boring. That does seem to happen quite a lot. Wales seem to play Fiji and Australia. Those three nations seem to play each other quite a lot in World Cups in recent editions. They must be sick of the sight of each other. I honestly do mean that. They must be quite frustrated with playing each other as regularly as they do. But that could breed rivalry. That could actually breed contempt for each other. That something may happen in a World Cup match, let's say 4 years ago, or in this World Cup. That 4 years down the line is remembered by some players. Or there was a nasty incident there was a spear tackle, or there was a late hit here, or there was something said, or the game was controversial. Builds a bit of rivalry. They're in the same group again, and the rivalry is intensified. For some fans, it does get a bit repetitive when you're playing the same nations over and over again in the tournament. And then you have to start asking questions of how the draw works, and the transparency of the draw, what systems they put in place to decide who goes into what group. But it is what it is. I would argue that is 20 the right number for the World Cup? That is an interesting question. There are some saying that the World Cup, rugby-wise, is too big for the quality depth that we have, or the lack of quality, depending on your point of view. I would argue that it may be just at the right size for the depth of the game right now, although some of the Tier 2 and Tier 3 nations are massively improved from what they were a decade ago. You could argue that. There is no perfect formula or perfect, because think of it this way: we're having the same discussion in football right now, with the Euros, the men's game expanding, and the World Cup expanding in 4 years' time. The women's Euros still is at, 16 teams. The men's Euros has expanded. So I think the women's Euros felt too short. It did feel too short. It didn't, and there was a big gap between the group stage matches and the knockout stage. There were bigger gaps. Because we've got used to, let's say, the men's Euros being bigger, and then the World Cup being bigger than what it was. When you have a smaller tournament or a smaller format tournament, it does feel a bit strange. But the Rugby League World Cup's expanded this year as well. And there's going to be rugby pretty much every day, because the women's tournament is being played in parallel with the men's, which is fantastic. But there is that quality depth, or the lack of. So again, you want to avoid those blowout games, those blowout scores. We don't want to see those record-breaking All Blacks Japan scoreline, or Australia Namibia scorelines that we've seen 20, 30 years ago. We don't want to see that happen. It's not a good look for the game. And we don't really get those blowout scores so much these days, because even the smaller ranked nations will still get a try or two or something, and won't get completely blown off the field. But I think rugby union is in a very, I would say, is in a crossroads right now. There is a big debate about how the size of the tournament, how many nations should qualify. I would say there's a lot of Tier 2 and Tier 3 nations that should qualify maybe, or be given the opportunity to qualify. Um, Also, the cost of hosting the tournament and the turnaround between games. So then you've got to look at how big squads are allowed to be, and squad depth, and resting those players, and rotating players, and squad depth will be tested. Considering they are bringing in rules now to limit the amount of games players can play in a calendar year, um, whereas rugby league has always had a 20 odd round season plus finals. So rugby league has already gone, yeah, the player is not going to have an Ironman streak with the way they structure their season. So it is interesting, how the Rugby World Cup, should it expand? Is it sustainable to expand it? Um, I would argue, I think it's probably at the moment, with the quality, depth, the depth of quality that globally there is right now, um, and the struggle and the issues that financially the game is facing. I think it's possibly about the right kind of balance. I would say it hasn't necessarily got, um, everything, um, right. We've had discussions about, the state of the game, state of professionalism, the financial, uh, situation the sport finds itself in. Um, and, you know, those discussions are legitimate discussions to have, about the number of teams. It's the same with the Football World Cup, which is going to expand in 4 years' time. Um, and it's the same when we talk about domestic leagues like the NHL or Major League Baseball or the NRL, for example, with expansion coming in the NRL, with the Redcliffe Dolphins joining next year, and then discussions already in place about where the 18th team is going to go. Is there enough talent depth to support it? I would say in the short term, no, but in the long term, yes. Um, the Football World Cup, obviously, if they had gone to Morocco, it wouldn't have been 48, it would say at 32. Um, they decided to go with three co-hosts: Mexico, Canada, and the US. And so, therefore, rightly or wrongly, they've decided to expand the tournament. Now, I think 32 is about right. That's personal. I think 32 is about the limit you should get for an international tournament. I think the Euros will end up at 32 teams eventually. Um, I think 32 is the acceptable amount for, a tournament like the FIFA World Cup. It works. Balanced groups, balanced knockouts, no playing second round, group stage, one group stage. 48 is going to be interesting. The logistics behind that, um, how the qualification process is going to change. Um, I think the Euros numbers right now are okay. The only bit about the format I don't like is the number of best third place teams coming out the group stage to the knockout stages is the bit I'm a little bit. They could have worked out a better formula, to be honest, for that. Um, but there's no perfect system. Um, I don't mind the expanded Euros. I felt that last year's tournament was a fantastic tournament. Most games, I think there was only like one or two goalless games in the tournament. I thought it was a very good tournament. I enjoyed it. Um, but there's no perfect system. Well, we'll be back in February. We're in discussions for Netflix style access all areas. Do you like that? I don't mind my sport documentaries. but I'm not a fan of the fly on the wall ones. I know Sunderland Till I Die is obviously a fantastic documentary, and it's over several series. It charts the ups and downs of Sunderland football. But generally speaking, I'm not. It, these are sports that are trying to branch out and entice some of these younger fans um, who may not watch on traditional media formats like TV or listen on radio to the sport. Um, and with Liberty Media, for example, Drive to Survive now running F1, I don't agree with all the decisions they've made necessarily. I think F1 is also at a crossroads. Um, and the way last season ended, I mean, I'm no longer a fan of F1. I've made that clear on this channel for several years now, as I've fallen out of love with the sport currently. I prefer, saloon car racing and GT racing and endurance racing, so like Le Mans 24 Hours, things like that. I have my books on F1, the history of the sport and such. I prefer hard top racing. When Portugal drew 3 group games, Italy drew 3 group games in the 1982 World Cup and went on to win it. They didn't lose. They didn't lose a game, did they? So I wouldn't say that's a mockery. You've just got to survive the group. Yes, I did watch the 24 hour. I watched bits of the 24 hours of Spa. There were some big shunts in that, but it's Spa. Um, I did watch snippets of it every now and then. I tuned in. I think I watched about 4.5 hours of the race in total. Um, and we've also had the 6 hours of Monza. I've watched that as well. And the previous endurance race at Spa before Le Mans. I prefer that over F1. I prefer that form of motorsport over F1. I think F1 has definitely lost something, and the Drive to Survive. While I understand Netflix's end of things and the documentary makers' end of things, they've done it in the NHL. They've done it with uh, other fly on the wall documentaries like Sunderland Till I Die. Um, I think there comes a point where, okay, done now, boring. It's an old format. The sports documentaries I like are the ones that look at retired players and how this team won a championship. The Nottingham Forest one, which is on Netflix, is a fantastic one. Why did they? It's just how the format was working at the time. They realised that wasn't a great format, and therefore we now have the group stage we have now, and then the knockout stages from the second round onwards. That work far more better than the formats they had earlier on. Fans didn't particularly like it. That's when FIFA and UEFA and organisers listened to what fans wanted a bit more. Um, the responses from fans and the viewership figures weren't necessarily what FIFA wanted, and they looked at it and they were like, "Let's streamline our competition a little bit more, make it a little bit more fan friendly." Another sport circuit has made changes to make it more safe after a fatal crash in F2. Yeah, no, um, no. I would argue Spa is probably just as dangerous now as what it was then. They haven't where the crashes happened. That's not where they've made the changes. They put a few more gravel traps in other locations. Eau Rouge is still flat out with tarmac runoff with the crappy safer barriers allegedly that springboard you back into the track, because there was last year at the 24 Hours of Spa that massive shunt in the 24 Hours of Spa last year. At the same spot, the fatal crash happened in F2. They have made no changes to that section at all. Where there were gravel traps, there is now tarmac runoff. They have not changed the pit lane exit at all. Still, pit lane exit still goes up the hill. You've got the modern F1 pits plus the classic pit lane that goes around the corner. So pit lane hasn't been adjusted. So Spa will always have big shunts, big crashes. They're doing some new grandstands. I think they are making some further adjustments to the facility at Spa. I've noticed. Spa is an iconic circuit, and when the F1 goes there, you are going to see the impact the current regulations have on the cars. What are my views on trans women in women's sport? I think it devalues the battles that women have gone through over the last 30, 40, 50, 60 years. It's a flaw in the civil rights movement. It's Look, I've got some friends who post some rather interesting views saying it's trans genocide. They misinterpreted what the word genocide means. It's called common sense. There's a lack of common sense, right? It's called common sense. But there now seems to be okay. Hang on a second. Okay, hang on a second. Let's think of this logically. You're going to put a trans woman in the boxing ring with an actual woman. We've seen it happen. We've seen the results of, oh Christ, she's got brain damage. That's basically a chick with a dick who's just knocked out a chick with normal chick bits. But no, there has to be a moment where you're going, hang on a second, that's not right. And this has divided a lot of people on the left wing, ironically more than the right. I try and keep it is becoming a political issue now. Politicians are wading in on it. But I have to think on a common sense, pragmatic view, have their own separate category. I tell you now, no one will watch it. Just saying, but have their own separate category because there does come a point where it devalues women's sport. It devalues women's civil rights and the battles they've had for a lot longer than the LGBTQ plus community. Women's rights and the struggle for them to get the vote and divorce law and contraception and sport. They banned women from playing football for a long time, which is ridiculous, for the best part of 50 years. There has to come a point where you're going, hang on a second, this isn't right. And it's not because I've got loads of friends. I mean, I actually know some trans people. Women who've decided to transition to men, which is rarer, and men who transition to women. I know some. And they're lovely people. Even they will go, no, that's not right. There has to come a point where common sense has to prevail. And a lot of sports now going, enough's enough. And there is a minority in the LGBTQ plus pride movement and on the left that going, this is genocide against us. But no, actually, ironically, your rights have been enshrined in law the entire time. It's just the people who govern you have chosen to ignore that law the entire time and suppress you. This is a governing body going, this is a women's category, biological women's category. You're a bloke who identifies as a woman. You're in a different category. Sorry. We don't have a category for you yet. We saw it with that male swimmer who it just completely unbalanced, women's competition, and female swimmers are going, this is just not right. We saw it with cyclists, weightlifters. We've seen it in mixed martial arts and boxing, which is can you imagine a transgender athlete in women's rugby? Christ, or women's football. Like, that would cause internet meltdown. The fact that it's already common sense has prevailed here. If you look on social media, however, it becomes a far more it becomes a toxic shit show. Is the best place to describe the debate that's been had there. But governing bodies are saying, no, stop this. This is something's not right here. It's devaluing the women's sport. That we're trying to increase the value of it. We're trying to grow it, and then suddenly it's now becoming a laughing stock when we want to be taken seriously. Um, Women's sports have to battle so many barriers anyway to be taken seriously, to then become a laughing stock again. It does devalue the battles that they've had to get to, like women's football. The battles they have had to get to this point, and they're still mocked online. They are still dismissed by many. They're still the butt of all jokes. And the women's national side in this country has just won the bloody Euros, and they're still being taken the piss out. And there's still sleazy articles about their private lives. And I'm thinking their sexuality or their sexual preference has got no bearing on their ability to kick a football. And I look at some of the articles the tabloid media are writing about the private lives of some of the women players at this Euros. It makes you wonder why there's not more openly gay or bisexual male players. Just look at how the media are now going after their private lives. I couldn't care if she's a lesbian, bisexual, or straight. Can she kick a football? Yes. Can she score a goal? Or can she stop a goal as a defender or as a goalkeeper? Yes. Fantastic. Oh, but by the way, she's shagging her teammate. I don't care. Doesn't bother me. Doesn't bother me. Their sexuality doesn't bother me. But when the media starts writing distasteful articles about an athlete's private life, which is totally legal, by the way, as in their private life, what they're doing, I find that uncomfortable. And it makes you wonder why we don't. And that sort of sums up why, should I say, why we don't have openly gay players in the men's game. In a whole variety of sports. Football, rugby union, rugby league, ice hockey. It does sort of make sense now. If this is how the mainstream media is treating our female players in sports and writing, and these are very distasteful articles. I read one of them. I thought, what? This is really distasteful. And the fact that some of them are very open about their sexuality, that's fine. But some of the articles I felt made me feel uncomfortable for them, and as the reader going, why is this journalist writing this crap? Who needs to know this? Surely it's their personal decision who they're in a relationship with, or if they want to stay single or whatever. Yeah, the Blackpool youngster. Yeah, he's not a first team regular all the time. He's about, I think he's 19 years old. He's only recently broken into the first team. I know the guy you're talking about. It doesn't bother me. It really doesn't bother me. Like, as long as he's capable of doing what he's paid to do, which is play the game. Obviously, he wouldn't have done it if he didn't have the backing of his teammates and his manager and his coaches and the board and the fan base of Blackpool. And fair play to I mean, he's a very young lad. This is a guy who's well, I don't think he's even 20. I think he might be 21. He's a lot. He's about the same age as my brother. So he's a very, very young lad, and that's a big, you know, statement to make. That's a very big decision he has just taken. If that's the women's game, I don't care. It might be. If that's the women's game, it's not a problem. I think half the England women's team were openly bisexual or gay anyway. That's just won the Euros. So if that's the women's format of the sport, it's an everyday thing. It doesn't bother the players or the fans or whatever. there will still be those morons on social media who, and those journalists who write distasteful articles, but it doesn't bother me. It really doesn't bother me. I do forget his name, and that is really. I think that's a good thing. I forgot his name in a sense because he's just another member of the Blackpool squad. It doesn't bother me. He's a Blackpool player. He plays for one of my club's rivals, so it it and but fair play to him for making. I mean, Thomas Hitzelsberger is the famous one who came out just after he retired, um, and he was a fantastic player, Thomas Hitzelsberger. Um, and he waited till he had stopped playing, and that is unlike Fashanu, who came out while he was still playing. Hitzelsberger waited till he had stopped playing, and that tells you why. Um, and Thomas Hitzelsberger was a fantastic player. Fashanu was a fantastic player. And Hitzelsberger only came out, I think, about 4 or 5 years ago, 6 years ago. And he had only recently retired from the game. And that tells you something. I was the pride round in the NRL, the Manly Seagulls and their pride jersey, and the fact that the Pacifica players and those players from the Maori and the Pacific nations background, a lot of them are very, 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 very religious, evangelical kind of Christian religious. 7 of them refused to play in the first team. And then they were calling up some of their reserve grade players, and a handful of them were not actually, I don't feel comfortable with this. So they had to cobble together a team out of players under contracts and in the reserve grades and junior grades. And I was watching NRL 360 on the NRL website. And Paul Kent said, "Look, I'm a journalist and an ex player. I know that there are gay and bisexual players in our game. We will not out them, but we know there's a handful of openly gay and bisexual players within the game playing right now who haven't come out publicly to the public, but their teammates and their rivals know they're gay. It doesn't bother them." Toby Rudolph, the Cronulla Sharks player, has talked about same-sex experiences. I think the way he worded it in his interview didn't come across the best way to describe it. Um, but how he comes across is a bit of a pisshead, basically, who likes to party hard on his days off, and he is known to like a drink or two. And he's got to be a bit careful with that. Um, and yeah, I think the fact that will we get to a stage where, well, fans in general, let's just say fans, um, and within the game as well, like take fans out of it, social media out of it. Actually, within the game, like, will a coach want to, sign me as a player because of you? Will we get to that point? I wouldn't say rugby's done totally well with it. I think it's done better with dealing with players coming out and officials and coaches. So you've had Nigel. If when you have one of the best referees in the world who's openly gay, I think that does help. When you have one of the top internationals in Gareth Thomas coming out, dual code international, that does help. I still think there's a long way to go. I think fans seem to be more accepting because it's possibly because it's more brutal sport. There's more brutality in the sport because it's a really brutal contact sport. Um, um, but both codes of rugby, I think, can still do better. Ice hockey is the one that I'm really surprised about, um, and that stuns me. Um, I, I know for a fact there's openly gay players within ice hockey globally. I've got friends who play. I've got friends who coach. I've got friends who are members of supporters clubs. I am surprised there are no openly gay ice hockey players right now. Um, we've seen it in cricket, we've seen it in rugby league, we've seen it in rugby union. In the men's game. Women's game is completely different. It's not an issue because they're seen to be doing manly sports. So when women are playing rugby league, rugby union, football, cricket, ice hockey, they're already seen to be doing something manly. So when a female player comes out and goes, "I'm gay or bisexual," it doesn't really bother anyone. It's not an issue. But when a male player does it, it's everyone loses their frigging minds, which I don't understand. Do I think yes? There has to be. There has to be. The NFL has a big issue with players feeling current and ex players feeling comfortable talking about their sexuality. Um, players. So I do believe the NHL. Yes, I absolutely do believe. I believe. So I don't think I believe. I know that there are gay or bisexual players in the NHL by law of averages. Let's say I think how many registered NHL PA players is what 600-700 NHL PA players because that's including those on two-way contracts. Um, there will be at least anywhere between 7 to 70, depending on which survey. Yeah, how many teams are in? How many players? You've got your 20-man roster plus your scratched players. So I think you're allowed up to 30 players at the moment with the COVID rules in place to cover COVID positive tests. So anywhere between on two-way contracts as well in the AHL and ECHL. You could look at a team could use up to like 30 to 40 players a season because of injury and trades. So let's say a team has its AHL and ECHL affiliates, its roster, those players on two-way contracts, plus those players. You're looking at um, let's say 40 players, 40 to 50 players. A team might use that many players because of injury, illness, and suspension in a season. Um, you're looking at about 3 to 7 players by law of averages, which is I that's for looking at studies. So it depends on what study you're looking at. A couple of players would be openly gay or bisexual. Um, um, in regards to how many players are on NHL, I have watched an Irish Hurling game and I've watched Gaelic football as well. I've not watched Shinty. There's one for you. Um, or Bandy, which is another one, which is similar to ice hockey. No, I've actually watched it in real life. I, yeah, and I've watched it on cable TV as well. Um, I don't know where we've got onto the sexuality of athletes, but it's an interesting discussion point because I think we're talking about transgender first, um, trans athletes. Um, people blowing up about trans athletes. Christ, we can't even accept one gay football player in the domestic leagues in England without having a meltdown on the internet. The fact that I've forgotten his name is actually a good thing because it doesn't stick in the memory, which says to me he's gone under the radar and he can get along with doing his job, playing his football for Blackpool. He's a young lad. Let him just play out his dream, which is being a professional football player. But yes, the fact that the Daily Mirror was writing an article about the love lives of the female players who just won the Euros for England, I felt was distasteful. Um, um, that I felt was uncomfortable and distasteful, and gutter journalism. I'm not bothered who you know. Beth Mead is dating. She's dated both men and women. She's currently single. don't think she'll find me attractive with my mullet, but I'm not bothered about Beth Mead's, love life, or Chloe Kelly's love life, or Lucy Bronze's love. Are they good football players? You know, are they good at the level they play at in the women's game? Yes. Did they win a tournament? Yes. Let's celebrate that. Let's not delve into their private lives and do what we did to Paul Gascoigne and Paul Merson and Tony Adams, who were all battling addiction, and we just destroyed them in the media. That's what the media now wants. Is they've had this feel good story and they want to go after them now. Okay, now because they've been successful, now we can tear them apart. I don't like that about the British media. I never have. British sports media is just as toxic as the rest of the mainstream media. Um, yeah, there is a good documentary actually on YouTube about the 2008 financial crash, and they interview the Secretary of the Treasury, and they interview George Bush as well. He's in the documentary, and it's really interesting. And it came out during the Obama administration, so obviously they can't interview Barack Obama and all that because he was president at the time. But that's a good watch. You've just got to have an hour and a half to 2 hours of spare time to watch it. It's on my like list, but it's about 2,000 videos down my like list, but it's definitely worth a watch. Um, no male players to come out in darts or snooker. No, not that I can think of, but it doesn't really bother me if they were or not. Darts and snooker are sports with other bigger problems to worry about, apart from is a player gay, straight, or bi. But especially in snooker, there's far bigger problems in snooker to do with corruption and match fixing allegations and spot fixing allegations than, oh God, is this player, oh dear, he's gay, fans are going to hate him. Snooker's got bigger problems than the sexuality of its players, and who cares? It doesn't bother me if a player's gay, it doesn't bother me if a player's straight. I just want to see a player play. If I want to watch snooker, I want to watch Ronnie O'Sullivan versus Judd Trump. That'd be a fantastic first round match, let alone a final. And I want to see that that last frame be played out like they've got to play safety to win it. You know, um, Greece and Ireland were, and sport has suffered as a result of that. This is why I'm really surprised how Iceland have constantly overperformed sports wise, whereas Greece have struggled sports wise. But Greece was struggling financially before the crash, financially, and sport has been impacted by that as well. Commonwealth Games got medals: rugby sevens, South Africa, women's Australia, cricket Australia, women's hockey England, netball is on now. Australia versus Jamaica, hockey final tomorrow. Australia versus someone. Um, India. Australia, yeah. Australia are a sports mad nation. It would be weird if they weren't at the Commonwealths or Olympics competing for as many medals as possible. Much like us, they're a sports mad nation. They are just a bit more sports mad because it's really in their curriculum more so than ours. They put more emphasis at school and university into their sports programs. It's more culturally seen as, even at recreational level. Um, it's a big thing in rural communities as sport, all the way to the major cities. Sport is a big thing. Um, you'll see out in rural communities they play rugby league and AFL. Um, uh, so there you go. There are many different relationship dynamics. Yeah, shouldn't be any of my business. Doesn't bother me. What starts annoying me is when individual players start getting on that social bandwagon, and it doesn't bother me as long as they're not in a violent relationship where they're the aggressor, um, and getting accused of domestic violence. I don't care. And this is when I did my Sam Burgess video. I did mention his legal issues he's had since 2018 has definitely, for some rugby league fans and sports fans in general, changed their opinion of him. Even though he was found at the end of it all, so his legal troubles are over for now. It did damage his reputation with the wider English and Australian rugby union, rugby league fan bases. He's now seen in a different light. Um, um, Which nation do I consider to be the most successful across all sports? It depends on what dynamics we're looking at, because the US is dominant in sports that other nations don't really compete in, like baseball and basketball. Okay, is a global sport, but is not on the same level as, let's say, rugby or cricket. So the US is dominant in sports that no one else cares about, basically. Um, they do have a very good collegiate NCAA program, though. So when it comes to track and field athletics, the US are very, very good. Um, if we're talking about cycling, um, the Australians, us, the other European nations, South Africans are quite good at cycling. At the Olympics, a lot of nations are very good. It's a difficult one. It depends on what we're talking about: team sports, individual sports, amateur, professional, Olympic, which is more amateur than professional because you need to have like government funding and bits and funding formulas. It honestly depends on what we're looking at. Are we talking about team sports? Are we talking about professionals at club level, international level, things like that? Greece weren't helped by the '04 Olympics. No, that's why they were financially struggling before the 2008 crash. Was their overspend on the Athens Games, which already bankrupted them. Um, Australia has the geographical capacity, does not have the climatic capacity. Can you imagine, Alice Springs being 1 million people? No, no, um, absolutely not. In theory, yes. Australia is actually huge geographically. It's a continent, pretty much. But for its population side, Australia is very successful nation in sport. Um, so is New Zealand as well. New Zealand and Australia really punch above their weight when it comes to international sport. Um, if the UK breaks up, will this impact new sports? Yes, ice hockey. So the international team that we have in ice hockey, there's a lot of Scottish players who currently play in the GB side. Track and field athletics. These are the Olympic sports. And there's funding formulas for the various regions, and then you have the national funding formula. Um, but in reality, motorsport may be slightly affected domestically. In reality, ice hockey, the Olympic program, track and field athletics, the cycling program will be impacted to a certain extent. It will have an imprint. Um, at the same time, Scotland will be in serious trouble financially because they just cannot sustain the funding matrix for the sports they need. Ironically, when it comes to the funding matrix, when it comes to UK athletics, for example, or the ice hockey um, governing body, little bodies, there's more than one. They don't have a unified UK governing body for ice hockey yet. So close last summer. And then a couple of stakeholders voted against it, and they had key veto votes. Stupid. Um, but the Olympic programs, and then the funding for grassroots development like velodromes for cycling, swimming, Olympic swimming pools for training, um, track and fields, athletics, the bobsleigh. The bobsleigh program is based out of Loughborough anyway, so and a lot of that's British Army. No, the Olympic programs and those World Championship programs, yes. But the international team sports, no. So like football, rugby, cricket. Um, when will Nadal or Djokovic stop winning majors? Probably this could be the last year they win anything, and I generally mean that. Nadal, he pulled out of that semi-final because of injury, and I know why. He's having constant injections in his foot. He's got a degenerative bone condition that affects his feet. Uh, Nadal is done. Djokovic, we'll see. We'll see with Djokovic, but Nadal is done. Djokovic, maybe a year or two at most. This is now the moment where there's the changing of the guard, and a whole wave of new players are going to be competing for the Grand Slams now. I think Nadal is done. He's stated that um, he's got this bone and muscular condition that's degenerative, which is going to get worse. He's going to need constant steroid painkillers, cortisone basically injections with morphine in his joints of his ankles and his feet to continue playing. If he has to continue having this, he's going to go, no, it's not worth it. In regards to Djokovic, he has had his own injury problems. It's debatable how much longer he can go for. And of course, with what happened with the Australian Open, with his visa being cancelled and the hoo ha around that, and the difficulties around that, it will be interesting. It's just a question of how much longer he wants to go. I wouldn't have thought it's too much longer. Their bodies are breaking down. They're not as dominant as they were prior. Djokovic is more controversial than anything now, and that's to do with the Australian visa saga that he had. Not necessarily. It's win percentage for me. That would say you're the best ever, because some players have notoriously short careers but have a very high win percentage. They're very dominant for their specific period of time. I would say their longevity makes them some of the best of all time, but at the same time, do they have likable personalities? Nadal, yes. Djokovic, no. I prefer watching Nadal play than Djokovic, because Nadal is playing with a degenerative health condition, which is impacting his ability to play. The fact he's still playing on with his ankles and feet pretty much held together with gaffer tape, and the fact he's having to take painkillers just to walk, and he's in constant pain. Yeah, I would go. Yeah, I would say Djokovic is respected to a point. I think he's definitely the best all-round player for his style of play, but it's obviously some of his political views, some of his personal views don't agree with mainstream society. Um, he can be a bit of a prickly personality, but a lot of the individual athletes you see in things like golf and tennis and snooker, they do come across as quite the individual sports. You'll see more prickly personalities than team sports. Cam Norrie, yes, he can. Absolutely, he can. He's learned how to do it now. Fear won't be there. He's played against really good opponents and beaten them. He's taken that next step. Yes, he can. Absolutely, he can. Wales splitting from England. The legal system's been intertwined since the 1300s, so it would be weird. Um, I don't see that happening. Scotland, I don't see happening either, to be brutally honest, because their only policy is independence. They have no security policy, no currency policy, no head of state policy, that kind of thing. It's just Scotland trying to get possessions. I don't think Scotland will survive on their own, personally. Um, but that's a debate for the other channel completely. Uh, um, but no, there was a question about golf in the LIV tournament. Will golf go back to how will golf continue? Will this LIV format continue? I'm going to say this: every time a rival league is set up tends to fail, cannot sustain itself. And the examples I will use is the Super League with Rugby League in Australia in the mid 90s and the WHA in ice hockey in North America in the 70s and competing against the NHL. The other example is the CFL trying to expand into the US into NFL territory, and it basically destroyed them. So they're the examples I use. The CFL is still obviously going, but it's far weaker than what it was 20 years ago when it decided to take on the NFL at its own game. And the Super League wars in Australia did damage rugby league for the best part of, well, still damaging it now and still having an impact now with the dual venture clubs in St George Illawarra and West Tigers. And the WHA folded; it just couldn't sustain itself. They were spending money like it was going out of fashion. Do I like the LIV? Golf is definitely a sport that I care less about now than I did a decade ago. And a lot of that, much like cricket, is to do with the TV rights and how they've taken the Open off free-to-air TV. The Masters at Augusta, it's only the final day now. The final day now that's from free-to-air TV in this country. And some of these players signing up for the LIV Golf, I mean, it's obscene amounts of money, and they're already multi-millionaires. They don't need the money. But hey, it's not my concern. Golf to me is gone downhill for many years, for a long, long time. And unfortunately, some of these players haven't covered themselves in glory. In regards to signing up to Greg Norman's event, and in my opinion, Greg Norman, I think, has gone down in my book. I had a lot of respect for Greg Norman. As a player and as an ambassador for the sport, I don't have that much respect for him now. But that's, again, personal opinion. Do I think the European Super League will happen eventually? No. The clubs have got what they want with the changes to the Champions League format. That's the club owners, at least, club money men. And UEFA have got what they want with their new spending rules. So a balance has been restored. It's the fans who don't want either, really, because the current spending rules are being openly flouted by PSG and Barcelona right now, without any consequence. When clubs have been, pulled up on their financial spending, they go to the Court of Arbitration of Sport and have their penalties reduced or overturned, which costs money. And the fact that the Champions League in the UK, at least, has been taken off free-to-air TV, it's all about that. Fans are not a consideration. But when we're talking about player welfare and the amount of games being played, coaches and players are rightly going, hang on a second. And when you've got those armchair fans and those armchair coaches go, you only got played 90 minutes twice a week. It's not a problem. It was a problem for Christian Eriksen when he had a heart attack on the pitch. Player welfare, I think, has been underestimated. Yes, these players are well compensated for their deeds on the field. But if other sports are trying to restrict or cap the number of games a player can play in a calendar year, like rugby union, for example, or rugby league, it's amazing to me that football hasn't come up with, hang on a second, stop. Now, we've seen some players in ice hockey and football and even rugby league have Ironman streaks where they've played every game for 2, 3, 4 weeks. They've not missed a game for a long period of time. And that's fair play to them. Fair play to them, they've not missed a game. Any game they've been available for selection, they've played is fantastic. And when you've got a player who's played every minute of the season, that's even more fantastic. Without being subbed off, that's just something that doesn't happen very often. And fair play to them. They've kept themselves fit. They're professionals, that kind of thing. But when we're having discussions about capping the amount of games a player can play in a calendar year, I think there was one of the Spanish players last summer. If you include his internationals, he played 80 games in a year or something. Club and internationals, if we're talking about 80 games. That is ridiculous. That's almost NHL kind of season numbers, where a player's just played 60 to 80 games a season. And ice hockey players will do. They might play out of an hour's match. They might play 15 to 20 minutes ice time. They're not playing the entire hour, so they have the rotation. And of course, with their training and how the physical demands of ice hockey compared to football are different. When a football player is playing 60 to 80 games a year and has played every game that he is eligible to play for in that time frame, that is ridiculous. Yeah, that's the one, Pedri. That is ridiculous. Though that's NHL games per season numbers. And he very rarely got subbed off. He was very rarely started on the bench. He normally would be a starter who played 80 to 90 minutes a match. That is ridiculous. That's almost on Iron Man streak. Now, yes, he's young, so his body's going to heal quicker and recover quicker from strenuous activity and all that. That is still frigging ridiculous. And it was brought up in commentary last summer in the Euros that he had played that a lot of games, and if they got to the final, would be playing over 80. That isn't heard of. That was never heard of. And I when I do player profiles and I look at players' playing careers and I look at the club history videos I was doing earlier in the summer and like record appearance holders and all that. A lot of the guys who got the record appearances for clubs played their entire career at a club over a 10, 15, 20, sometimes 25 year spell from the age of 18 to early 40s, right? Not once did one of them play over 40 games in the season. So what he did was ridiculous. How to reduce games in England? Well, we've already got rid of the FA Cup replays pretty much. I think they eventually go completely from the calendar. I don't think there's any FA Cup replays this season because of the World Cup, but I think FA Cup replays completely disappear. There's talk to get rid of the FA Vase, FA Trophy, and League Cups as well at some point. There's been discussions about restructuring those competitions or getting rid of them altogether, which ultimately impacts lower league clubs financially. Now, we've always had this debate when managers come out and go, the fixture congestion's terrible. The lower leagues get forgotten about when it comes to player welfare and fixture congestion. They're trying to limit our squad sizes even further, which we are against and we're pushing back against. So the football leagues had some pushback from clubs about restriction of club squad sizing. So again, player welfare and how you figure that out. I think they should bring back you've got the first team and then the reserve team, and actually increase squad sizes so you can actually have more player rotation. We're starting to see the rotation policy, like the old Rafa Benitez joke, the Rafa Benitez rotation policy. We're starting to see more managers like Guardiola and Klopp, Arteta, Conte. They are starting to rotate. It's a trend that's been going on now for about 20 years. That's come into the game where managers like to rotate their players more. That was the Rafa Benitez style. Claudio Ranieri, so the Mediterranean style of squad rotation. So the Ranieri was known as the Tinker Man, obviously, and Rafa Benitez, it was always the rotation policy. which became a bit of a joke. Um, but it was actually was proven to work with the amount of trophies, these winning trophies that these guys have done, like Champions Leagues and league titles and Scudettos and things like that. When these guys are coming back with silverware, I would go back to straight knockouts myself, but that means UEFA makes less money and the clubs make less money. And while the players may actually enjoy it, the club owners won't because they have less money in their pockets, and it's also with the TV companies and sponsors wanting to get exposure and sponsorship deals and TV deals and stuff like that. Um, we have a third tier European comp. It's called the Conference League, Europa Conference League, which in reality should be the Cup Winners' Cup. They should rebrand that as such. The group the fans have already said this, and players have already come out and said this, and coaches and ex-players have said, "Oh, it's like it's another dead European rubber. It's a dead rubber." Um, do we need? It's a money maker. It adds to the fixture congestion, no doubt. Um, it tests squad depth, absolutely no doubt. Um, this is where I think football. This is where domestic. This is where club football was a big. Um, I don't watch it as much now as I used to. It's a big turn off for me. When you know you're watching a game that means nothing for both sides. So like a Champions League dead rubber where it's the third place team, or it could be first in the group playing a team that's finished top. Um, it's a meaningless game that key players get injured in. It tests your squad depth unnecessarily. It doesn't need to be played, but it's been played anyway. I guess it depends on club size. For a Leicester Conference win would be well. You say that. Um, I but having these pointless group stage games that mean nothing. It's just unnecessary extra fixtures that just don't need to be played. Fact. We all know this, but UEFA and the club money makers, the club power brokers, club board members are like, well, we want to make as much of this as possible. And then you get the managers going, we're playing too many games. The fixture list is insane. Um, but the interesting thing is their employers, so their club chairman and the club owners and the club boards, are actually pushing for even more games. Whereas the players, the coaches are going, hang on a second, like, I want to play every game, coach, but I'm knackered, I need a rest. And the coach is going, the welfare of my players, we're playing too much. Three games in a week is too much. All this kind of thing. And so the priorities within the sport are confused. Oh, look, yeah, no, the Conference League, yeah, look, Roma fans, obviously, they've had a lot of heartbreak in European finals, and it's silverware. But what I'm saying is the pointless group stage games are the ones we don't need. The fixture congestion, which every coach has come out, has been made worse by the COVID over the last 2 years. We know this. Um, but when you've got high profile managers and players and ex players as well going, we have fixture congestion. Um, there's problems. And the old UEFA Cup was straight knockout. The old Cup Winners' Cup was straight knockout, um, which was fantastic. And then they changed the format. They got rid of the Cup Winners' Cup and they merged it with the UEFA Cup, and it became the Europa League eventually by rebranding. And then you get the Conference League as a sort of, I will bring back the Cup Winners' Cup kind of as that third tier European competition, but in a different name. And in reality, all they've done is they just added more European games and devalued the European competitions, but at the same time, just rammed as many games as possible in there. And it is impacting player welfare. It is impacting fans cannot afford all this. And yes, they have used the Europa League as an experimental, experimenting with changes and format changes. And then you look at the proposed changes they want to bring into the Champions League, and I'm like, it doesn't work. It works for other sports like ice hockey or basketball, where you can play back to back, sometimes back to back to back. You can play 3 games in 3 days. It works for baseball. Does not work for football. You would not see that in any other football competition. And I've never liked the third place team in the Champions League going down to the Europa League. It devalues the competition, and it's the same for the Europa League with the Conference League. It completely devalues the next competition down. Um, but I think the way the UEFA coefficient works has already devalued domestic cup competitions. The whole structure of European club football needs reform, and while I believe Alexander Serafin is the right guy to be in charge of UEFA, um, I don't know if the the way the game needs to be reformed, if that is going to take place, with the fact the clubs still have a lot of uh, influence on decisions. Um, yes, I would say it hasn't achieved its objective because the final was between an Italian and a Dutch side, and in my lifetime, Italian and Dutch sides have won the Champions League and competed in the UEFA Cup final, the Cup Winners' Cup, and all that. They've won the other major European club competitions in my lifetime, as leagues. So those lesser European leagues didn't make the final. Bodo Glimt did quite well though, but other than that, um, it hasn't necessarily achieved its full objective. But it was the first season of the competition, so we will see what happens down the line in the next few years before the next bout of restructuring of the European format to take place. Um, oh God, don't have another one. Um, Celtic went. I think I also never liked their play. I mean, look, Scottish football has been hampered by the European competition, no doubt. Um, and you could argue of scrapping the European coefficient and changing the qualification rules for Champions League, Europa Conference League, all that kind of stuff. Bring back the Cup Winners' Cup, change the formats of the current competitions, where you do say less is more. Um, because I do agree there's too many games right now. There's too much fixture congestion. It is having an impact on player welfare. The amount of players, there's more players getting injured now than there was before. Players look more tired and more fatigued, and that's been noticeable. Um, and then they've got the club country debate, and it's going to be interesting for when the season has its mid-season break for the World Cup. What players end up going to the World Cup, how fit players are, squad depth being tested, who goes, are players injured, are players suspended, that kind of thing. 4 European Cups, they could have a Super Cup group stage, yay, more money. The cynicism in that statement. I generally I'm falling out of love with the club game. I still love the international game with the World Cup and Euros and stuff. I'm falling out of love with how the club game is run. It's not run very well. And we've discussed this to death on the channel about how poorly the club game is governed, financial governance being poor, structures of the club game being poor, um, and generally the fans being considered an afterthought. The really poor um, financial situation a lot of clubs find themselves in, where they've got all this money, they've had all this money, they've won all this prize money, they've got all the sponsorship money. Where's what Barcelona should not be 1.3 billion in debt. Real Madrid should not be 900 million in debt. They just shouldn't be. Yet they are. and questions need to be asked about why these global brands are. If they were, I don't know, a standalone club without club presidents being elected by their members, they would be liquidated. They wouldn't exist. Um, I like the Conference League because fans get to go to obscure locations. Hey, I'll say this: football was great for your geography knowledge. You learn by osmosis. Um, I think, given time, we'll see how the Conference League plays out and how it benefits the lesser European leagues financially, and with the UEFA coefficient, etc., etc. The UEFA coefficient is a flawed system, um, but that's neither here nor there. Anyway, I'm going to call it a night because I have to be up early for work tomorrow, and then I'm off Tuesday. I've got a funeral in the morning, and then afternoon I can do a lot of content. So there'll be a lot of videos coming up. But yeah, I'm going to call that a night. Thank you very much for all your questions. Sorry if I couldn't answer every single question that was posted, because some of them I think I sort of covered in conversation. Answering other questions, they all sort of linked into to one question seemed to link into another. But I've tried my best to cover as many questions as possible. And that's the first time we've discussed transgender athletes on this channel here, and I think common sense is prevailing. I think sport really was the litmus test, and we'll see what the outcome is. But what is interesting is these athletes aren't challenging the rulings by the governing bodies, um, which I find interesting. It was sort of, I think these are test cases, and we may see things down the line that you know could prove interesting legally. But anyway, I'm going to leave that there. Thank you very much for watching. Really appreciate it, and I'll have some more content for you very, very soon.